Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. David Graieg. I'm not finished yet, David. Okay. David grew up in Perth and is married with 3 children. He is an athlete. You wasn't expecting that next, were you? David is the WA record holder for the decathlon in the 35 to 39 age category. He would thrash us all in the sprints, and I know he would thrash me at any one of those 10 disciplines. I'm impressed. But of course there's more. David is the founder of Why Christianity. Maybe you can tell us more about that during the talk. He is a sessional lecturer at Alphacrucis University College, an adjunct lecturer at the Australian College of Ministries, a teaching assistant at Curtin Uni, a sessional marker at Morling College here in Perth, an academic sessional at the University of Notre, Australia. He holds a PhD from Sydney College of Divinity, a Master of Theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, and a BEng from UWA. He's the author of Resurrection Remembered, published in 2024, which was a finalist in the Biblical Studies category of the 2024 Christianity Today Book Awards. Probably not bedtime reading, but one I think academics will be putting on their bookshelves. So, with nothing further ado, please welcome David to the stand.
Yep, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for everyone coming. I do think most of you will be able to beat me in shot put, as well as most people in pole vault. If you can just sort of make the introductory jump, you're doing great, and I may have just got one above that. Also, the book, I think it definitely is bedtime reading. It'll help put you to sleep, so if you've got a problem, yep. But we're not looking at that tonight, so we're just looking at creation evolution. To say I have joined ISCAST as a fellow, and my background is not in science. I don't have a science proper degree. I guess engineering is kind of like applied science, but I haven't done that for a decade, and so I'm coming from the theological, biblical studies aspect of it. And so we just want to look at what are the different views that Christians hold on creation and evolution, and you'll see I purposely put it in smaller font to say it's important, but I'd say it's a secondary issue of creation, and we'll see that a bit. And I know I'd say the evolution part does become the main bit, but I don't think it should necessarily be the whole conversation. In terms of the handout, sorry, it's kind of long. Everything that's on the slides is on the handout if you want it, and if you prefer to have an electronic version, if you go to that website, whychristianity.org.au, the first, most recent post just is this handout as well, if you prefer it that way. Yes, in terms of Why Christianity, so it's a charity that I started like 20-ish years ago, basically wanting as an engineering student to see more Christianity being put forth in the public arena, and particularly the apologetic side of that, a case being made for Christianity, and I wasn't aware of any other organisation doing that really. That being said, the same year I registered at John Dixon's, the Centre for Public Christianity started in Sydney, and they basically did everything I sort of dreamed and had a team and equipment and that, so we haven't done a whole lot, but I'm trying to do a little bit more in Perth now. Yep. If you do Google Why Christianity, you'll find that it's such a common term that my website would probably be like the 100th hit. So you'd need to have to put Why Christianity ORG or something, otherwise it just does not appear. Anyway, we'll jump in. So we're looking at what is creation. I'm meant to go for, I think, I'm told about 45 minutes. There's about 30 slides to try to get through. Obviously, if it takes too long, we can skip things, and we're going to have time for questions at the end. And you can also, if you've got a clarification in the middle, happy to take a question as we go. But so just saying, what are we saying is the doctrine of creation? What do Christians believe? And it's basically this. This is quoting from Paul Copan. He says, it is the view that everything that exists and is not God is created by God. So that is a theological definition, which say you don't find that exact expression in the Bible, but they're saying that's sort of representative of what it is. And so Christians generally affirm that creation is ex nihilo, meaning it's not from anything. There wasn't something there that God refashioned and made. There was nothing, as in, not anything. and then God created, he brought it into being. Creation is a good thing. We say there's particularly sort of Gnostics in like the 2nd century would say creation is bad. Also some sort of Greco-Roman beliefs would say, the material's bad and you want to escape it. Even today, there's people who would be like, it's not a great thing to be in this world, but Christians affirm that creation is a good thing. And then creation is free in the sense that it was a free choice, an act of God. It wasn't like in pantheism, where the world is sort of an emanation that just, there's an impersonal God and it just sort of flows out of that God without his will or choice like that. So creation is, not from anything, it's good and it's free. Having said, so everything that exists and is not God is created by God, right? This is the doctrine of creation. And so part of the question is, what exists? And so this is like the curveball slide, so and it's probably bad of me to put it right up at the front. But basically here, one of the questions is, what does exist? And so at least philosophers will say that there's an infinity of entities that exist. And so in fact, I don't know how many quarks or atoms are meant to be in the universe, but it may be in the order of like 10 to the 100 or something like this. But they would say that's a finite number. And in fact, there is like an infinite number of numbers, for instance. And numbers are abstract objects. And the question is, like, do numbers exist? Do abstract objects like power, justice, love, or like mercy, or squareness, or roundness, or grayness, and things like this, do they exist? So this is sort of part of the discussion. And I'd actually want to say there's a variety of views that are covered on this. And I'm not trying to cover them all. I'm actually just sort of mentioning this to say that in terms of the doctrine of creation, this is actually quite a big matter and issue, but it's rarely even sort of looked at. And just to look at sort of mathematical objects, these are some of the main views that there. So some would say that mathematical objects do exist, and then some say they exist as abstract objects, and then they would say that they've been created by God, and this is like an absolute creationism view. Some would say mathematical objects do exist, but they're uncreated, and so they exist in their sort of own realm uncreatedly, and this is basically Platonism. Like if you know the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, that's like Christians are saying it can be done that, and there are people who Christians this is, who hold to this today. And then there'll be some who say they do exist, but they don't exist as abstract objects, rather concrete objects. And if you want a basic difference of concrete and abstract objects, that abstract objects don't cause anything. They're causally impotent. Like the number 7 doesn't make you do your taxes or something like that, right? Yep. Whereas, say, gravity, it does has causal effects and stuff like that. Yep. And then there's also other views that say that, hey, numbers don't actually exist. For instance, it's super hard for me to do all these top of my head, but so fictionalism would say there's no such thing as Wednesday, right? I mean, yes, it's the day between Tuesday and Thursday, but it's just a label that we give it, a fictional label like that. And so there'd be different opinions, but just to say this is a whole discussion in itself, and unless you had any further questions about that, we're moving on. But I was just to say, in terms of creation, like that's a huge amount of stuff there, and it's kind of overlooked, and I think it's worth. Because there's challenges against theism from that. So some people will say, well, if you believe there's one God who exists in 3 persons, and that means we've got mathematical objects, so did the one God exist before oneness exists? Like, did he have to create oneness, and then he was an example of that one God? And so they say, so, the idea of God is crazy. And it's been one way of saying, well, numbers don't actually exist. They're just fictional entities and stuff like that. But then, I mean, if you just say they don't exist, like, how does that relate to in science? If we say there are, one atom, or there's 10 to, I don't know the number, but 10 to the 100 atoms in the universe or stuff like this. So there's relevance of this, but anyway, we're moving on. So we can ask more, so why does this sort of matter? And particularly thinking less so than in the creation of abstract objects, but creation of the material world, the universe. The general logic is that creation is the first thing that's mentioned in the Bible, And it's mentioned in Genesis, and this is considered the foundation of the Bible. And so some people say, if you can't trust the first chapter, why would you trust the rest? Which I actually don't think that logic actually works, which is to say, if I did my maths test and that I got the first question wrong, it doesn't automatically mean that I would get every single question wrong. You should see on a case-by-case basis. So even if it was the case, it wouldn't mean that. But nevertheless, because it has that kind of foundational thing, that's often how it's presented, particularly by skeptics who want to debunk and say, look, I've disproved Genesis, so I've disproved the whole thing, even though that doesn't actually follow. It's also though seen that Jesus comes to die for sins, and it's seen in Genesis that that's where sin is introduced. And so it has this connection too. And so again, they may say, look, if you get rid of the idea that we're sinners, if that's gone away, we don't have to worry about Jesus. And I'd say, again, that doesn't actually follow, but that's the kind of logic. Yep. Christians do want to say that all areas of our life should be surrendered to God. And that's to say everything has a place and it's important and it shouldn't just be ignored. So you shouldn't just take the other end. So my PhD on Jesus' resurrection, and I do think that's like the central part of the faith, but it's still not the only part. So you wouldn't just want to say, hey, look, I have no idea, who cares, if Jesus rose, just sort of whatever. So it is, taught in God's word, and if you believe that's inspired or inerrant, as many Christians do, then it's something you'd want to rightly understand, right? Yeah, and so that's the kind of logic that if the Bible is God's word, it teaches on this, should be believed. Having said that, there's hardly anyone is going to say it is a science textbook or a history textbook, but where it touches on scientific matters or historical matters, Christians tend to say that it's God's word, it should be accurate in that regard too. Yep, and then I guess finally I do want to say though, there is a sense though that there is at least one part of the Bible where they say, if Christ is not raised, your faith is in vain, but it doesn't say like, if God did not create in 6 days or God didn't create through evolution or something, then it's thrown out. So that sort of things has to be kept in balance and sort of why this topic matters. Anyone want to comment or challenge something there? I feel like recording, I should do a monologue and questions more at the end, but yeah. So in terms of then, so what does the Bible say about creation? We're not going to look at all these, but I'd want to highlight that, there isn't just sort of one text. It isn't just read Genesis 1 and 2 and we say that's the end of the discussion. So in fact, there's many places and both in many sort of different genres where creation is talked about. And depending on, like I mentioned, the first one has 2 creation narratives in Genesis 1 and 2. So there's even debate about how those go together, whether it's really just one creation narrative or whether it's sort of 2 distinct and things like that. But there's also then passages in the New Testament that talk about creation. And from this, there's going to be different opinions, but they would say there's some things that seem to be in agreement and some things and there's difference in these different passages. And so, if you like, some of the main things are that these creation accounts teach that Yahweh, or the one true God, created all that exists. It includes heaven and earth, the sea, the land, the plants, trees, animals, and humans. And then where they tend to differ is in the means that he used to create, which is to say some seem to apply out of nothing. Some seem to say he slayed the Leviathan, and they can be poetic texts. How do you understand that? But the point would sort of still be that's the stuff you need to discuss and see what the difference is on. There can also be a difference in the order to some degree, with like Genesis 1 giving 6 days, and depending how you take, say, Genesis 2, for instance, it just talks about like in the day that God created. And some people say, well, it's just focusing on like one of the days and that. Yes, there's different ways of taking it, but in general still there is some difference in the order. And then even sort of the length of time, if you compare sort of the Psalms and things like this, they can mention. So having said that then, we skipped 2 slides there. This is taken just from a particular individual. He's not representative of all Christianity, neither am I as a speaker as such, but he would say that there are 3, this is one of the institutions I've taught at, so he was a theology lecturer here, and I think he's about right as a representative of what most Christians would say. Is we get some non-negotiables regarding then the doctrine of creation. And this includes that 1, the sovereign God of the Bible created all things and created them very good. 2, God uniquely created Adam and Eve as first human beings, and God created them sinless, perfect, and in relation to him, We will see in a moment that, I should read the third one as well, and third, that Adam and Eve deliberately sinned against God and brought judgment upon the world. Both humanity and nature are broken and abnormal. Particularly for the second and third one, there are different ways that Christians would hold that. So it's not just implying that it's non-negotiable that you take it as, say, 6,000 years ago, that it can be he uniquely created them millions of years ago or things like that. There's different ways, but that's the general thing. Depending on when you've looked, like institutions like Biologos, they would probably on the surface have not really liked the phrasing of the second and third, but in more recent years they have come closer to affirming this, but not in a sort of more literal way. But you could challenge them as such, but they're in general the kind of non-negotiables that Christians have said. And that's to say there's flexibility in other matters, such as the time, when it happened, how he did it, and things like that. One of the things I'd want to highlight in the discussion, I keep pressing two slides at once, is how do we understand the term evolution? And to say it can be used in different ways, and there's times when it's just referring to biological change and diversity, or two, the idea that life forms came from earlier ones, a kind of descent with modification, or three, that there's genetic variation through natural selection, which can sometimes be called microevolution. Four, as there's common ancestry of a single tree of life, which can be called macroevolution. Or five, you could use the term evolution to say it implies it's naturalistic or atheistic, that is, all the universe and life came to be without God. And so I guess by definition, Christians are going to really disagree and challenge number five. In general, Christians can sometimes be known for pushing back on evolution, but I'd want to say at least as defined with the first three versions, there's almost no Christian, including young earth creationists, who would disagree with that understanding. Verse 1 to the first three uses of it. So it becomes more of a matter of will Christians affirm that or not? And basically what we'll see in the next slide is that some do and some don't. So what are the different Christian positions on this? The different ways of grouping this, I personally find this the most useful. I think I'll list in a moment some of the resources, and there's a book that's called the most recent one on this is called 4 Views on Creation Evolution, and you say, well, I've only listed 3, so why am I against the 4th? And the 4th then was intelligent design. And so generally the advocates of that say that you don't have to, you can be any of these views and reject intelligent design, but you could equally hold to any of these views and affirm intelligent design. So I don't see it as a separate view as such, so that, that's an open question whether or not you think there's evidence of an intelligent designer in that. But so the different views, I would say, are generally framed like this, at least in the modern last 100 years or so. And that is that there's young earth creationism, and we'll have a slide defining all of these in a moment, but this basically says that they don't think that God used macrobiological evolution. Likewise, they don't think that there's cosmic evolution like the Big Bang and stuff like that. Then it can be called either progressive creationism or old earth creationism. Basically says that the Big Bang cosmic evolution is true, but then it basically, and that is like old, it happened a long time ago, like the standard 13.8 billion years ago, but then they would reject biological evolution and say that God progressively created at another point in time. So he created the universe at one stage, another time he created life. And then finally you can have what used to be preferred to be called theistic evolution, but even someone like Biologos, which is, I'd say, the main website that sort of advocates this view, someone like Francis Collins and Delix Alexander, they would say now they prefer the term evolutionary creation, and that's to say they're all creationists of a kind. They believe there is a God who created, and it's sort of like how, And they would affirm basically both cosmic evolution, the Big Bang, and biological evolution as well. So just to explain the views. So some of the main ministries are Answers in Genesis, of which, if you know, Creation Ministries International split roughly 20 years ago. My understanding was they didn't have a difference in how you understand the Bible and science, but they had a difference in how to spend the funds. And I think the US wanted to build the Creation Museum and the Ark, and they didn't think that was a good use of the international funds, and so they split over that. But yeah, so this is how I would, and this is my definition of them, and I would actually probably say I'm not aware of anyone who defines it exactly as I do, but I think you'll see why I do it this way. So the young earth creationist view is the view that the best interpretation of the Bible is that God created in 6 consecutive, literal 24-hour days, and that the genealogies in the Bible have minimal gaps, such that when one adds up those genealogies, it indicates that creation occurred around 6,000 years ago, as measured by clocks on Earth. And the young earth creationist also usually affirms a global flood at the time of Noah, and that there was no vertebrate animal death before the fall of the historical Adam. That's a lot there. So a few things to highlight is, so it says as measured by clocks on Earth. So if you go to either one of those websites, you will see that they affirm. And actually, interestingly, one of the leading advocates of this was a guy called John Hartnett, who, yeah, I know we got John here. So I studied electrical engineering at UWA, and he was one of the physics lecturers who I had when I went through just electrical engineering degree. And so he has argued in writing that it depends where you put the clock to measure. I am also told that you should have cosmic time, and that the Big Bang is not relative to, like, if someone was traveling at the speed of light or whatnot. This, in some sense, is above my pay grade, but I mean, as someone who taught at UWA physics, he would argued that if you put the clock at a particular place in the universe, you'll get different times, and so as measured from Earth, you could say it was 6,000 years, but if measured from distant galaxies, it would say 13 billion years. And you would say, that's not what young earthers believe. And I would say, this has been around for about 20 years. And yeah, you can go see that young earthers do include that. That being said, he actually went to teach in Adelaide, and he came back to Perth a few years ago. I think he retired. And I actually caught up with him last year and went to ask him. And he's since said, I want to say he's actually said this, like, has he put it in writing type of thing. He's told me he's less interested in this, and he's more into politics and stuff now. But he said that he thinks his view is unlikely now. So yeah, but I guess I'd still want to say major young earth websites still endorse that as part of their view. So there's just nuances within them. I guess another common thing I think to highlight is I feel young earth creationists are known for saying that, oh, you can't have death because there's no death before sin, that. But again, if you go on their websites, they would say they don't have a problem with, like, insect death. If it wasn't like if Adam stepped on an ant or a mosquito got flied, they'd be like, that was murder, that's wrong. So there's certain kind of deaths, like, and I guess this has actually vast implications for the fossil record, right? If you hear the statement that we see death and destruction in the fossil record, that's not okay, a good loving God wouldn't do that. Well, so actually there is a whole bunch of kinds of death that they would accept as saying that. Yep. And yeah, so that's the young earth view. I don't know if there's any questions about that. We'll go to the others. It helps to contrast a little bit. So the older earth position basically says that the Bible need not be interpreted as being 6 consecutive literal 24-hour days about 6,000 years ago. Instead, the days of creation, the text could be metaphorical, or as in, like, they could be ages or periods. There could be gaps either before those 6 days or between the days and things like this, such that, the Big Bang and biological evolution, while not necessarily correct, are nonetheless compatible with the Bible. And this view usually holds then that Big Bang cosmology is roughly correct, so they would affirm that, but they usually reject biological evolution. And they would say both because they tend not to think that's what the Bible teaches, and they also tend not to think that the science adds up for it. And so Reasons to Believe is one of the main ministries that advocates that, Hugh Ross and others. Yep, and then the final view then is evolutionary creation, with Biologos being the main website. And it basically says that in some manner, God used evolution, understood in that sense of macroevolution, either by directing it each step of the way, or usually it's more like you're saying he just sort of planned it out from the beginning, so it would unfold by itself. It's not like he had to tweak it as it went. But yeah. But so those are the three main views that Christians hold. And I'd really want to emphasize that they're all Christian views. And so I do believe that, both the advocates of them are Christians, and that there's no reason to sort of be denouncing each other, such that I would say that this is ultimately an in-house discussion, which is to say someone can be a Christian and hold to any of these views. They are mutually exclusive, right? So they can't all be correct and they could all be wrong as such, but it need not be a matter for someone to say, hey, I can't accept Christianity because these Bible teaches 6,000 years and that's crazy. Because you can say, well, there's many Christians who hold to other views, and so you can still be a Christian and hold to those views and stuff like that. So I would want to say that, the Christian views, it's hard to know, and in general, as someone who has taught apologetics, I never taught theology of this, but I'd wanting to say it's good to have people researching the different views, and there should be more peace and harmony amongst them. In saying this, I know I've spoken to Chris Mulheron, and he's told me, it was about a year ago, but that ISCAST allows all the views, although they do have more representation in some positions than others as such. And so just recommended some resources if you want there, and one is the 4 Views on Creation Evolution book, which has those 3 views plus intelligent design, but as I said, it allows any of the views to add in intelligent design if they desire. And another view would be a recent book last year on perspective on historical Adam and Eve, and it has both sort of a young Earth literal view. It has one where Adam lived about 600,000 years ago, and it's like the pre-ancestor of Neanderthals and things like that as well. It has one that it's more recent and metaphorical, like God placed a sort of soul in ape ancestors some time ago and things like that. And there's different views that, again, Christians hold all these and are still thinking through them. I did define evolution. I didn't define Big Bang cosmology. This is something that I have read up on briefly, but again, this is beyond me. And actually, I do see do we have 3 people with physics PhDs here? I forget. Is it? Yeah. Anyway, there you go. So you should really ask them, because I think they're all teaching at UWA and Curtin in physics. So they're the ones. But I would just be, as a layperson, reporting that there's been recent, and you may say this is just like a wild statement. So I think this is actually, I put this in the last week, so this one's one slide that's not on your handout, to say regarding things with the James Webb Telescope and the findings they're having regarding whether dark energy exists or not. You can see this is a 2-part article where part 1 said the biggest crisis in astronomy, and this was their attempt to sort of resolve this, but they're basically saying that we may have some issues with the standard Big Bang model. And I am not really weighing on that, other than to say that that is a thing that's in discussion right now, and so in some ways that would also affect Christians' views on this. Going back to sort of the theological, biblical study side of it, my area, is to say one of the big issues is how do you take actually the first verse of Genesis, and particularly what's the relationship between the first verse to the rest of the chapter. And so there's at least 3 options here. And one is to say that God made an original creation, and this takes Genesis 1:1 as before the other days, some undefined period of time, and then it's said to have lapsed into chaos. Maybe there was don't have to take this, but sometimes said there was like a demonic war or something like that, and then such that Genesis 1 and 2 is then God recreating things and shaping out of that mess. A second option is to take Genesis 1:1 as a title. And so this is just sort of a heading. And so it's really saying when God began to create, there already was this view out of which then he created the cosmos. Someone like John Walton has highlighted some stuff on that, and several other scholars. But and so again, if you take either of those views, it wouldn't imply like a young Earth, and then that would still be good biblical scholars, not like liberals and the Christians who would take different opinions of this. And the third one is to take Genesis 1:1 as the beginning of creation, with Genesis 1:2 describing how God began to create, such that whether it's verse 1 or verse 2, 3, 4, 5, that's all events of the first day. And so in a sense, if you're taking that day, that would seem to indicate that that was talking about the beginning within that first that day, whether you take it's 24 hours a period or what. But yeah, so just to say there's issues about just even that. And if it interests you, I'd say if you get a biblical commentary, they should discuss some of these matters a bit more. And so this is like an overview talk. I'm just sort of highlighting and throwing probably all these spanners in. Another thing I would want to highlight is that there's different views about what science is. And particularly here, I'm kind of wanting to take a philosophy of science and say that there's actually no unified opinion on even just sort of what science is. I feel like as scientists, I know when I studied electrical engineering, I never, unless I skipped the class or something, I never learned sort of what is science in a philosophical sense. And I guess with every discipline, you could say like, whatever it is, there's the philosophy of that discipline. But instead, we just used applied science and just did it. But yeah. And so generally, science is going to involve studying the natural world through observations and formulating some sort of hypothesis and testing this through experiments. Yep. And in that sense, Christians are free to investigate how they think God has made the world. And Christians would say when it's rightly interpreted, like the science, as well as you rightly interpret the Bible, then these should come together. But the problem then is if they don't always, it's got to be careful with making one dictate to the other. Yeah. I guess I want to say, so I didn't really put it on this slide, but it's to say there are people who are both scientific realists who think that science is likely getting at the real truth, and there's also scientific anti-realists who think that science is, there's different views of anti-realism. If you've ever heard of Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that's a famous anti-realist view that basically says that science is a game that scientists plays, and that's their rules, just like you could have the rules of sport or something like that, and he didn't think it's actually getting at the truth. And yeah, you may find that weird and crazy, and I would but I'd just say amongst professional philosophers of science, there is different opinion about how to do it and whether something has to be verifiable or falsifiable and things like this. And yep. One thing I'd want to highlight is what's known as the theory of underdetermination. And this basically says something like, for any finite set of observational data, there will always be potentially infinite number of general laws consistent with those data. And this would apply, I actually think it applies not just to science, but really to all aspects of life, including interpretation of the Bible. So in a sense, you're reading a passage in the Bible, like Genesis 1:1, there are multiple ways of interpreting it. It doesn't then mean that anything goes. You can have different sort of criteria to say what's more probable than not, but it nevertheless shows that. And so the example I give, which is probably not the best, but is to say if you had certain points of data, you can come up with different lines that will all meet those data. And it's to say which is the best one. There you're going to have to use other criteria because there could be multiple ways of meeting that. Yep. And yeah, obviously my application there is to say again, so if you've got the scientific data, you've got biblical data, there's going to be multiple ways of which people could fit that into. I'd want to highlight that science, I really just say if you know what scientism is, I would say that's the view that science is the measure of all that matters, and I'd say that's really self-defeating because the idea that you should only trust scientific things is itself not a scientific thing. It's like a philosophical statement, it's an ideological statement. And to say there are some presuppositions to science that you have to assume, and there can be certain reasons to take some axioms over others, right? But nevertheless, that. And in that regard, I would say that Christianity does provide a good foundation for these, but it's to say that the things that go into science in that. And these would include like the existence of a theory-independent external world. So you can't actually prove that so this is philosophy, right? So this is crazy stuff. But you can't actually prove that there is an external world. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of what's known as solipsism. And that's the view that, it's really whoever's saying this, but there's only one mind that exists, your mind, and everything else is rejection of your mind. Well, and so, yep. So the classic joke about that is there was like a philosophy lecturer who held this view, and all the students said, we have to take very good care of our professor because when he goes, we all go. But Yeah. So another one would just be the orderly nature of the external world, just to say, yes, it seems to make sense that gravity would apply here and elsewhere and it continues to hold, but that to some sense nevertheless is a presupposition, that's what we think, that we can know the external world, the existence of truth, like the laws of logic, the reliability of our cognitive faculties to observe the world, the adequacy of language, like to describe things, whether it's in mathematical language or some other language. Yep. The existence of values, so you have to assume things like we should test theories fairly or report honestly, and so forth. And just to say these would be things that go into science, so it's not like it can just stand on its own. And this slide here, I was actually, obviously, my memory was trying to bring it forward, so I already kind of touched that to say there are both realists and anti-realists with regard to science. I'd say most people are realists. I'd also want to say that most people haven't studied it. You may say maybe you don't need to. But nevertheless, in the philosophy of science, there are different views out there. So that's enough sort of like philosophy thing. And so I think the remaining 10 slides or so, I basically just want to look at a few issues that creationists hold and then say these are some of the different views that. So one is on the question of biological evolution. The question is sort of how would the changes come about? And this is really a young Earth explanation of this. So the young Earth view of it would basically be that in the beginning God created a certain animal kind and it had enough information that it could diversify over time. And so for instance, it's simplified a lot, but basically they'd say if you had genes for size and there was only two, like a big S gene and a small S gene, and if you had one big S and one small, it makes you medium. So some of their offspring could have two smallness and some could have like two largeness. And then their argument is that if then the large offspring has another generation, then they'll only have the information for that. And so they'd basically say that in their mind, that's one of the key things that they'd say why biological evolution doesn't explain from one single thing. And so they tend to think that rather there being, if you like, one tree of life, that there are in fact multiple trees of life. So for each of the created kinds. And there's different opinions about how many, but I think they'd often say for dogs, there was probably just one kind. But clearly for birds, there were multiple. I think they previously used to say that there was probably two cat kinds, a feline kind with like a house variety and your lions and tigers and stuff. But I think they've since actually come to say that no, there's probably only one cat kind. And then originally from that, you've got both household cats and lions. So that one, don't quote me on, I have to go double check on the website. But yeah. And so, yeah, there's questions about sort of the mechanisms, biology, and there was what are we on slide 22 here? And so I decided to cut this one out. I feel like I wanted to go to 33 and I went to 3. That didn't work. So just to say, there is a website called The Third Way of Evolution, which, not biologists again. But this is really not Christians, although on their website itself, they say that some Christians have tried to hijack and use their stuff for promoting this. And so I took this out for time and now I've decided to add it back in. And they want to say that they don't hold to either the standard views of evolution nor sort of the rejecting skeptics of Christians and stuff like that. And they want to see a third way of how it's done as well. So I guess this is to say, then whether it's the old earther or the young earther who tends to reject macro evolution, they've sometimes pointed to this and say, here you go, see these other people saying the mechanisms don't work. Yep. And so I guess the point of them is you could say there could be another way of doing it apart from rejecting the standard evolution as well. Another issue is basically how to deal with the fossil record. And in general, then if you're old Earth creationists or evolutionary creationists, you'd basically say that what is taught in the secular world is correct. There's no issue with that. And so there's Christians who take that view. So in that sense, this issue becomes a challenge for young Earth creationists because they're going to say, no, we disagree with the science on that. And they'll generally say then that this is a burial record from Noah's flood. And so you'd have to, there's a big sort of topic within itself, but again, I'm just trying to sort of lay out the framework and say, yes, there's some Christians who agree with that, and then there's some who would take other view. And then I guess the burden of proof, the responsibility is on them to show how they could interpret the data in a way that's consistent or that. And in general, then I guess the other sides, whether it's the other Christians who are old earth creationists, everly creationists, or even secular science in that sense will say, yeah, they can't do it. But yeah. Another issue is just sort of the dating of life, and this is basically to say that whether it's through rocks or organic matters, they have the various amount of atoms which decay over time. Yep, and in general, again, the evolutionary creationist or the old earth creationist basically says we can accept the standard position, the dates and stuff like that. So there's Christians who hold that view. And again, and I guess you're going to see this is kind of a pattern, is the young earth creationist is saying the no, because the standard dates are given millions of years. They're saying no, so they tend to say stuff like, we've had recent volcanic eruptions, such as 1980s of Mount St. Helens, and when you date them, you still get millions of years, so they say you can't trust the methods elsewhere. I've actually interacted with some of the Australian Creation Ministries team on this and asked, well, if you've got this data, don't you then have the assumptions of how much there is and stuff like that? So can't you redo it? And they seem to say no, because there's more complications. But I actually feel like unless they can start to show that and give an alternate view, people are not going to sort of like jump ship, even if you say, hey, there's some problems here, unless you can give another plausible model. It's not going to encourage people to move as such. Yep. So another issue would be the genealogies. If the young earth creationists say, look, if you add these up in the Bible, that you get these roughly 6,000 years. And so, yeah, I would basically say you can look at a young earth view that tries to say that there generally aren't gaps, or they tend to say if there was, it only stretch it out to say 10,000 years, you wouldn't get millions of years either, which would then just allow for different views of really doing the historical Adam, because that it dates to Adam, not necessarily to creation, depending on how you took those first verses of Genesis 1:1 or 2, for instance. Yeah, but then you could see, if you want, an old earth response to the genealogies, and they'd say it's not meant to be functioning this way and used for that. The question can be, where did Cain get his wife? Which is to say, on the young earth view, if Adam and Eve were the first two humans and they had children such as Cain, Abel and Seth, yeah, where are they marrying from? And so if you read the historical Adam book, you'll see, yeah, there's different views on how to handle this as well. And so that's why many of them will say there was originally a whole group of Homo sapiens, of which Adam and Eve were part of this sort of tribal group that. But the young earth view basically tend to say that it was his sister that he married, and they'd say that because creation was good, that there aren't the genetic problems at that time for siblings to get married. But yeah, I'm just saying, but the evolutionist old earth view, in theory, I'm just saying they could, like it wouldn't change the whole viewpoint for this, but yes, in general, they're saying no, there are other people around. Yep. And then the young earthers will ask them, well, are those people fallen as well? Is it just Adam fell and his offspring, or all humanity? And there's ways, so you could take Adam as a type and saying that people fell into sin and stuff like that within that viewpoint. I've just got a couple more, I think 3 more, and one is to look at dinosaurs. And so generally then the evolutionists basically would accept what's taught in the public. The old earth creationists would say that no, they challenge biological evolution in a macro sense, but they do think that God separately, progressively created dinosaurs a certain period of time, and they generally say that they went extinct before humans. Yep. And then the young earth view says that dinosaurs are either sea, air, or land animals, and so created on day 5 or 6. And so they would have lived beside Adam and Eve. Yep.
Isn't the accepted position that birds evolved from dinosaurs and not the other way around?
Yeah, in the standard. So if you're saying in that, right? And I guess so. Well, in that sense, this view is going to affirm that and say, yep, that's correct, that's what science shows, and that fits. Yeah, if you're just, so I'm not in that view. So, they're going to reject that, right? So the young Earth view is going to reject the idea that dinosaurs evolved from birds.
No, I'm talking about the old ECs.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. Well, I guess I almost want to double check their website, but so in general, they don't believe in common ancestry, right? So they're also rejecting the idea that from a single organism, everything evolved. So rather, they take the idea that God progressively created at certain points in times, and like the creation of dinosaurs was something that happened. So I don't know, I guess they went extinct at that time, but like say 70 million years ago, God created the dinosaurs, and yes, they went extinct. And then 1 million years ago, created humanity. Yeah, so they're distinct, separate creations, and they don't see it as evolving in that way. But they do take the sort of the time scale, but yeah, they would see problems both scripturally and scientifically with macroevolution.
Yeah, it's just your text there that's wrong.
Okay.
It would be that birds did not evolve from dinosaurs, not dinosaurs did not evolve from birds, I think. Nobody says that birds evolve, whatever.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe I need to correct that, but yeah, it still seems.
Typo.
Anyway. Yep. Anyway. I think there's two other issues. So on Noah's Ark then. So generally, young earthers are going to say that it was a global flood, and it included 2 of every animal. Technically, the clean animals had like 8. Trying to keep it brief here. And they'd basically say there weren't as many species, and you can see some of their studies is to say how many they think there was, and was it possible to keep them on a boat for that period of time. And then in theory, I can't see why a old Earth or evolutionary creationist couldn't adopt that view, but generalists say no, it was just a local flood, and so it didn't have to have literally every animal kind in the world on board. So I said this was the last one. I can see there's actually one more after, but I think this is 29, so I think we're almost there. A question can be, could the early parts of Genesis state that people lived like 900 odd years? And in general, I'd actually want to say this is an issue that all the views are not entirely sure about. The young Earth view generally says that yes, it's because the young Earth view tends to want to say we take the Bible sort of literally and seriously, and they're hesitant of that. Though I'd want to say all the views do want to take the Bible seriously. They just don't think it has to be taken necessarily in a wooden literary sense as such. But there's some questions, and the young Earth view would generally say, so it really does mean these 365 days of that, they lived old, and as they said, something must have happened that people end up living less after the flood, and but aren't entirely clear on what's happening there. And then the oldest views tend to say something like, maybe it's not meant to be taken literally, like there was a different base, way of counting or something like that, a different representation, or maybe it's like just symbolic for saying they lived a very long time. Interestingly, in the ancient Near East records, like Babylonian stuff for this, we also have the early kings, if you know things like the Gilgamesh epic and stuff like that, them also living really long periods of time. In fact, I can't remember clearly, but it's more than 900 years. It's like thousands of years. And so it's interesting that it's there, and it's sort of weird exactly how to do that. So that's an issue that Christians look at. And so I feel like we're going to, this one is for time. I feel like this is the last issue to look at. And this is really more of a challenge for the young Earth creationists then. So if they're saying that the universe is, we said, 6,000 years old, like how could you see light from distant galaxies that are more than 6,000 light years away? And so in general, they don't want to say it's an illusion, that God's just created light coming there, but those planets aren't actually there. And so there's a few different views that young Earth creationists have held. One is that God made the Earth just looking old, and the idea they might say is that God would have made a tree for Adam and Eve, and it may look like it was tall, it may have needed the rings to help survive, but it doesn't mean it was that, and it wasn't a trick either. But in general, that's not the way of one of God. Another option is these relativistic models, where I mentioned before that like John Hartnett, his book is Starlight, Time and New Physics. Yeah, he said that it's possible that, yes, if you measured on Earth, it would say the universe was 6,000 years old. If you measured on a distant galaxy, it would say 13 billion years old. And I was saying that's actually accepted within the young Earth position, although I said a person actually spoke with him, he's stepping away from that. And he actually prefers the second model, he said now. So another view they take is this anisotropic synchrony convention model, which basically says that the speed of light is always measured two-way, and that it's usually taken as, I guess it's the same speed going one way as the other way, but I guess it would probably be mainly to tackle this issue, which you might say that's sort of like an ad hoc reason to invoke this, but they'd say that it could be the case that the speed of light is 2c in one direction and infinite in the other, and then that would mean that the light coming from tens of millions of light years away is in fact actually getting there instantly. Yeah, I don't fully grasp this. You can talk to the physicists and say that, but I guess there are some physicists as well, so in theory, go check out their book and see what they think is that. And then a final view that young Earth creationists are promoting, like on their website, is by a guy called Danny Faulkner, and he basically saying this is like a time-lapse video. So basically, if you would have seen Creation Week, it wasn't just happening at regular speed, like God created stuff quicker than normal. And sort of as a weird transition, you may say that's just really ad hoc. He would argue that this is the same as inflation, sort of a period of like fast expansion. It was like a period of like fast creation by God. Yep. And that's to say, at least the young Earthers will say that the old Earth and evolutionist viewpoint have a problem as well, namely what's known as, they call the horizon problem. And that is that the temperature within the universe is fairly even, and we haven't had enough time, they say, within 13 billion years for the radiation to have reached that sort of equilibrium. And the general solution to that, as far as I understand, being reported as a layperson here, is inflation. So if there's a period of fast expansion, yep. Yeah, so having said all that, it's probably too much, but that's to say, hopefully that's just a useful introduction. And I would want to say that really the central thing, not the only thing, about Christianity is Jesus' death and resurrection. And yes, these other important matters, including creation, but really all these views are views that Christians hold, such that someone who's considering Christianity needs to consider first and foremost Christ, and they can adopt any one of these views then and still be a Christian, such that science in general, views of creation, evolution, the Big Bang, this need not be a reason for someone to just reject Christianity, because there are different Christian ways of doing that. But it's fine for Christians to sort of humbly try to figure this out and see, how God did it and, which one's right. Yeah. So, don't know if you've got any comments or questions. Thanks for listening and waiting through that.